The sun had only just begun to climb over the horizon that cool September morning, when Colonel James Wilson pulled on his worn leather jacket and swung his leg over his Harley-Davidson. The chrome of the bike caught the light and shimmered like liquid silver, a striking contrast to the modest quiet of Millbrook, Georgia, a small town that still carried the echoes of its slower, older days. For most riders, this charity motorcycle run was just a chance to feel the freedom of the open road and give something back to the community. But for James Wilson, it was something more sacred, a personal ritual he had never missed in the past 10 years. Beneath the casual jacket and the weathered boots was not just another middle-aged man enjoying a weekend ride, but a soldier who had given 30 years of his life to the defense of his nation. His chest bore ribbons and decorations that most civilians would have struggled to name, but to those who had served beside him, each one carried a weight of sacrifice. The Purple Heart told the story of bloodshed for his country. The Bronze Star whispered of courage under fire. The Distinguished Service Medal testified to leadership that had guided men through storms most would not survive. His hands were a living archive, scarred by explosions, burns, and wounds acquired on battlefields half a world away. Even the slight limp in his left leg was a permanent reminder of the day an IED in Afghanistan tore through his convoy, killing 2 of his soldiers and leaving him to wonder why he alone had been spared. Those scars were not just physical. They had carved into him qualities that few possessed: patience forged in chaos, clarity in confusion, and the ability to remain calm even when the world collapsed around him. These traits, invisible to the people waving from their porches, were the foundation of who James Wilson was. They would also be the very qualities that would sustain him in the hours to come, when his life would once again be placed under a test he had never expected on American soil. That morning, as he zipped up his jacket and checked the saddlebags strapped to his Harley, his wife Maria had come to the door. She had watched him head out on countless mornings, each one marked by the same cocktail of pride and worry. For 3 decades, she had lived with the uncertainty of military life: deployments, sudden calls in the night, letters that spoke in guarded words of danger he could never fully share. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, tugged at his collar, and whispered with familiar tenderness, "Be careful out there." To her, those words meant potholes, careless drivers, maybe the unpredictable behavior of other bikers. Neither of them could have imagined the storm awaiting him just miles down the road. Today was not about strategy meetings, classified briefings, or military operations. Today was about remembrance, charity, and community. The annual ride had become a cornerstone in the lives of veterans and families alike. Organized to raise money for Gold Star families, the husbands, wives, children, and parents who had lost loved ones in service, the event brought in over $200,000 every year. For Wilson, there was nothing optional about it. He had stood graveside with too many parents, written too many letters of condolence, watched too many flag-draped coffins descend into the earth to ever treat this day as just another community fundraiser. This was sacred duty, a small repayment to the families who had borne the unbearable. As his Harley roared to life with the deep, unmistakable rumble that set every biker's heart racing, Wilson eased into the line of motorcycles, weaving their way through the town. Around him were people of all walks of life: retired teachers with soft smiles, factory workers with grease still clinging to their nails, small business owners who closed shop for the day just to be here, and countless veterans who rode with the kind of quiet pride only service could instill. It was a tapestry of America in motion, united not by politics or creed, but by a simple conviction that freedom demanded sacrifice, and those sacrifices must never be forgotten. As the convoy rolled past neat rows of homes and small storefronts, Wilson caught sight of familiar faces. On her porch, Mrs. Patterson stood as she always did, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl, one hand gripping a small American flag, the other clutching a framed photograph of her son. He had died in Iraq 15 years ago, a boy who had once played baseball with Wilson's nephew. She waved to the riders, tears glistening in her eyes but a proud smile lighting her face. Wilson raised his hand in return, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest. This was why he came back year after year. This was why his service had mattered. These fleeting moments, smiles exchanged, respect paid, promises kept, were the threads that tied his decades of sacrifice to something larger than himself. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the faint sweetness of freshly cut grass. For a moment, Wilson allowed himself to believe this day would be just as it had always been, peaceful, purposeful, even healing. He glanced at the rows of riders ahead of him, their bikes glinting like scales of a moving serpent, and felt a surge of pride in the community's resilience. He thought of the soldiers who could not be here, men and women he had commanded, some buried beneath foreign soil, others fighting battles of memory and trauma, long after their uniforms were folded away. What Wilson did not know as he rode through Millbrook's quiet streets was that this morning's peace was only an illusion. The real test of his patience, his training, and his very faith in the country he had defended for 3 decades was about to arrive. Somewhere across town, a radio crackled to life in a police cruiser. A voice reported suspicious motorcycle activity on Highway 23, multiple bikes passing through, unknown intent. And in that moment, the course of Wilson's day shifted from celebration to confrontation. At 8:47 a.m., officers Mike Tanner and Dave Briggs exchanged a look in Patrol Car 47. Tanner, with 15 years on the force and a reputation that carried the shadow of complaints and lawsuits, leaned forward in his seat. Briggs, the younger officer who still carried the remnants of idealism, followed his partner's lead despite the unease that prickled at the back of his mind. Together, they would set into motion events that neither of them could control, and that would place Colonel James Wilson, decorated soldier, husband, and patriot, at the heart of a story that would shake the nation. The radio call that morning sounded routine to anyone else, but for Mike Tanner it was an invitation. Suspicious motorcycle activity on Highway 23, multiple bikes moving through town. Those words were enough. Sitting in Patrol Car 47, Tanner's eyes lit up with the kind of anticipation that had less to do with safety and more to do with confrontation. He had been on the force for 15 years, but his record was not one of quiet professionalism. Buried in personnel files were 17 citizen complaints, 5 allegations of excessive force dismissed by friendly supervisors, and 3 civil rights lawsuits settled quietly with taxpayer money. The pattern was there for anyone who cared to look, but in a small town like Millbrook, with a department more loyal to its own than to accountability, Tanner had continued without serious consequence. To him, the town had changed for the worse. When he was young, Millbrook had been homogeneous, insular, a place where everyone knew everyone else. Now families from Atlanta had moved in, bringing diversity he did not welcome. Different voices at the grocery store, new faces at the town hall, children of different backgrounds in the schools, it all unsettled him. He viewed the changes not as opportunities but as threats. Policing, to Tanner, meant keeping those changes contained. At his side, Dave Briggs listened quietly. Only 26, he was new enough to the job to still carry remnants of idealism. He had grown up on television shows where the badge represented courage, where cops were heroes, and justice was clear. But the world he entered was murkier. He had already seen Tanner push people too hard, lean on intimidation rather than protection. Each time Briggs had felt a knot in his stomach and promised himself that next time he would intervene. But each time his courage failed him. Fear of conflict, fear of being labeled disloyal, fear of losing his job had all conspired to keep him silent. Bikers, Tanner muttered with disdain, spitting into his coffee cup. His father had once been a cop too, and growing up he had filled his son's ears with grim tales of outlaw motorcycle gangs, smugglers, and violent criminals wrapped in leather and steel. To Tanner, the word motorcycle was synonymous with trouble. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. Always up to something. Let's go see what these guys are really doing. What he didn't know, what he didn't bother to learn, was that the riders on Highway 23 weren't criminals. They were veterans, teachers, small business owners, and neighbors who gathered once a year to honor fallen soldiers and raise money for Gold Star families. At the front of the convoy rode Colonel James Wilson, a man who had bled for his country and carried more scars than most men could imagine. Wilson saw the patrol car long before the flashing lights appeared. His heart sank, not because he was guilty of anything, but because he knew the script. His father's voice echoed in memory. "Son, when those lights flash, you move slow. Keep your hands where they can see them. Speak calmly. Don't give them any excuse." His father had served in Korea. had worn the same uniform of the nation, and yet had returned home to a country that treated him with suspicion. Wilson had prayed that things would be different for his generation, but too many encounters had taught him that the uniform did not erase the color of his skin. He pulled over immediately, shutting down the Harley and placing his gloved hands clearly on the handlebars. The riders behind him followed suit, the long ribbon of motorcycles unraveling into fragments on the roadside. In his mirrors, Wilson watched his fellow riders, ordinary citizens who had woken early to honor fallen heroes, being treated as suspects. The taste in his mouth turned bitter. Tanner stepped out of the cruiser with his hand already resting on his weapon. His body language radiated hostility, shoulders squared, chin lifted in the posture of a man ready for confrontation. Wilson recognized it instantly. He had seen soldiers adopt that stance in combat zones, when they wanted a fight rather than peace. This was not the careful approach of a professional seeking safety. This was the swagger of someone who had already decided the other man was guilty. License and registration. Now. Tanner's voice was sharp, commanding. Devoid of respect, Wilson's reply was measured, calm. Good morning, officer. May I ask why I was pulled over? I was following all traffic laws. Don't get smart, Tanner snapped. I asked for your license and registration, and I want to see what's in those bags. Wilson suppressed a sigh. He knew this type. Escalation would only serve the officer's ego. Of course, he said evenly. I'm reaching into my jacket pocket for my wallet. Slowly, deliberately, he produced both his driver's license and his military ID, handing them over as clearly as possible. Tanner barely glanced at them. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed them back. These could be fake. Dave, call it in. I don't like the look of this guy, Briggs hesitated. The man on the motorcycle radiated discipline, respect, and something else, authority. This wasn't some outlaw rider. His bearing alone suggested military experience. Mike, maybe we should... Did I ask for your opinion? Tanner barked, cutting him off. He turned back toward Wilson. Step away from the bike. I'm going to search it. Wilson's jaw tightened. Officer, you have no probable cause to search my vehicle. I've broken no laws. I've been cooperative and provided identification. You want to do this the hard way. Tanner's voice rose. We've got reports of suspicious motorcycle activity, and you fit the description. What description exactly? Wilson asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of quiet defiance. He already knew the answer, and so did the small crowd beginning to gather. Cars slowed, pedestrians lingered, and phones were raised, capturing the confrontation. Tanner ignored the question. He leaned over the Harley and began rifling through the saddlebags without consent. His hands moved roughly, tossing gloves, a jacket, and tools onto the ground. Then he found the folders. He pulled them out and began shaking them open, scattering papers across the asphalt like confetti. Charts, graphs, and sworn statements fluttered in the breeze. Wilson's blood turned cold. Those weren't just papers. They were months of work, classified analyses of police encounters with military personnel, broken down by race and outcome, evidence of discrimination that reached across states. There were testimonies from decorated veterans who had been harassed, beaten, and humiliated by civilian officers. There were recommendations bound for Pentagon leadership, proposals that could reshape policy nationwide. And now they were being waved carelessly in public by a man who had no right to touch them. What's all this paperwork? Tanner demanded, holding up a folder as though it were meaningless. The seals, the classification stamps, the formatting, none of it registered. Looks like fake military junk to me. Pages slipped free, carried down the street by the wind. Officer, those are classified military documents, Wilson said, his voice low but firm. You need to return them immediately, Tanner sneered. Classified? More like cover for drugs or guns. Dave, call for backup. This guy's running some fake setup. Briggs stood frozen. The rider had done everything right. His calm, his composure, the discipline etched in every move, it all screamed authenticity. Briggs wanted to say something, but once again fear sealed his lips. The crowd stirred uneasily. Among them stood Sarah Chen, owner of the local diner. A Taiwanese immigrant who had lived in Millbrook for 3 decades, she recognized injustice when she saw it. She lifted her phone and began live streaming. Her voice carried over the scene. This is wrong. That man hasn't done anything. He's respectful, he's calm, and the officer is treating him like a criminal. Her stream spread quickly. Within minutes, her daughter had shared it online, captioning it simply, "Police harassment happening right now in Millbrook." By the time the documents had finished fluttering across the pavement, thousands of eyes across the internet were watching, and in the crowd, another figure leaned forward, squinting at the markings on a page that had landed near his feet. Marcus Thompson, a Vietnam veteran, felt his pulse quicken. He had handled classified documents in his time, and he recognized authenticity immediately. His hands trembled as he picked up his phone, searching for a number he hadn't dialed in years. Something monumental was unfolding, and he knew it. Marcus Thompson's thumb hovered over his phone before pressing the number. His voice shook when his old commanding officer answered, "Colonel Morrison, this is Thompson. Something's happening here in Millbrook. A man, African-American, mid-50s, tall, bearing like an officer, is being stopped by local police. They're tossing classified documents into the street. I saw Pentagon seals. This isn't fake. Then I think he's high-ranking." On the other end of the line, Morrison's voice dropped into an urgent tone. "Marcus, do not interfere. Record everything. Keep the stream going. I'll escalate immediately." Then silence. Thompson's hands trembled, but he steadied his phone camera. Meanwhile, Wilson's heart pounded, though outwardly he remained calm. His training had conditioned him to mask fear, to let his mind work while his face stayed neutral. But inside, alarms blared. Classified materials exposed. A hostile officer escalating. A crowd gathering. This was spiraling far beyond an illegal stop. It was a breach of national security. He knew what protocol demanded. Slowly, he adjusted his wristwatch, pressing the crown 3 times in quick succession. To the onlookers, it looked like nervous fidgeting. In reality, he had just activated a priority alpha beacon, a distress signal linked directly to secure military command. Within seconds, hundreds of miles away, screens lit up. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez read the alert, eyes widening. "Priority Alpha from Major General Wilson," she whispered. That designation was reserved for extreme emergencies. She turned to her supervisor, Captain Hayes. His face drained of color as the coordinates appeared. "He's in Millbrook, Georgia, and the alert is flagged as classification compromise." Hayes didn't hesitate. Phones lit up across the Pentagon. Vehicles at Fort Benning were prepared. Helicopters spun their rotors. A chain reaction of urgency swept through command halls. Back on the roadside, Tanner grew more aggressive. "Step back, everyone!" he barked at the crowd, waving the folders like trophies. His arrogance only deepened as people muttered disapproval. Briggs shifted uncomfortably, his hands twitching. He could see the writing on the wall, yet fear anchored him. Wilson watched him, noting the hesitation, the silent conflict playing out in the young officer's eyes. Perhaps there was hope for him yet. But Tanner was too far gone. The livestream audience ballooned into the tens of thousands. Comments poured in. "This is outrageous. That's a general's ID he just threw down. Protect that man." Mrs. Chen's camera captured every word, every gesture. A gust of wind carried one of the scattered pages directly to Thompson's feet. He bent, squinting at the words. It was testimony from a decorated veteran who had been beaten during a traffic stop, despite presenting proof of service. The ink, the formatting, the classification stamp, all genuine. Thompson's blood chilled. He muttered into his phone recording, "This isn't a biker. This is a general. And those are real classified documents." Wilson's mind raced. He needed to buy 12 minutes. That was the average response time once a priority alpha was triggered. 12 minutes to survive without violence, to protect the documents, and to avoid a tragedy that could ignite a national scandal. "Officer Tanner," Wilson said evenly, his voice carrying over the murmurs, "you are making a mistake. Those materials are not yours to handle. Secure them, return my identification, and we can resolve this without consequences." Tanner sneered, jabbing a finger toward him. "You don't give orders here. You're not in your little army world now. You're just another biker I don't trust." His words dripped with contempt. The crowd gasped. Many of them knew Wilson, at least by reputation. They knew his service, his medals, his decades of sacrifice. To see him disrespected so openly was jarring. Phones rose higher, lenses zooming closer. Briggs finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Mike, maybe we should slow down. He's been cooperative. These documents, they look serious. Shut it, Dave! Tanner barked, spittle flying. I said call back up. Briggs froze again, shame creeping across his face. The scene teetered on a knife's edge. Wilson remained motionless, hands visible, his breathing steady. Inside, though, he tracked every detail. The crowd's distance, the weight of Tanner's stance, the growing hum in the air that told him reinforcements were coming. Then it happened, the faint vibration in his watch. Signal acknowledged. Response inbound. Wilson exhaled quietly. 10 minutes more. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. That's General Wilson, someone shouted, recognizing him. The name rippled like electricity. More phones went up, more streams went live. The story was no longer confined to Millbrook. It was racing across the internet. Tanner's confidence wavered just slightly as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. He shoved a folder against Wilson's chest. You're under investigation. Step back while I secure this evidence. Evidence of what? Wilson asked, his voice like iron. Of veterans being profiled? Of systemic bias. That's what those papers show. And now the world is watching you destroy them. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Even Briggs flinched. Tanner's face reddened, his jaw clenching. He opened his mouth to retort, but the low, distant rumble cut him off. At first it was faint, almost like thunder, then louder, rhythmic, unmistakable to anyone who had served. The sound of rotors, helicopters. The crowd turned, shielding their eyes against the sun. Black dots grew on the horizon, swelling larger with every passing second. Alongside them, a deeper roar emerged. Engines of heavy vehicles moving fast. Marcus Thompson grinned despite the tension. He knew that sound better than anyone. Help's coming, he whispered to no one in particular. Tanner stiffened, eyes darting skyward. What the hell is this? His bravado began to crumble. Briggs tugged at his sleeve. Mike, we need to stop. Something's happening. This isn't right. Quiet! Tanner snapped, but his voice lacked the same sharp edge. Wilson allowed himself the faintest smile. Right on schedule. He looked Tanner directly in the eyes. I warned you. You're about to face consequences you can't imagine. But it's not too late. Return the documents. Walk away with dignity. Tanner's laugh was forced, hollow. You think you can threaten me? That wasn't a threat, Wilson replied, calm as stone. That was mercy. The first Humvee rounded the corner, tires screeching as it skidded into position. Behind it, a convoy of military and federal vehicles surged into the town square. Helicopters thundered overhead, their downdraft whipping the scattered papers into frenzied spirals. Within 90 seconds, Millbrook's quiet streets transformed into a secured zone, swarming with uniformed personnel. The crowd fell silent, awestruck. Phones continued to record, capturing history as it unfolded. From the lead vehicle stepped a 3-star general, uniform immaculate, face set with grave determination. He strode directly to Wilson, saluted crisply. Major General Wilson, sir. Are you injured? Wilson returned the salute. I'm fine, General Martinez, but the documents already being secured, Martinez replied, gesturing to military police gathering the scattered pages with precision. We'll discuss the broader implications later. Right now you're safe. The words washed over the crowd like revelation. Major General. The man they had watched, treated as a suspect, humiliated and searched on the side of the road, was a general of the United States Army. The weight of that truth hit like a shockwave. Briggs nearly collapsed. His knees buckled as the enormity of his failure hit him. He had known something was wrong. He had felt it in his bones. And he had stayed silent. Tanner, on the other hand, stood frozen, his face pale. His arrogance had evaporated. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a federal agent approached. Officer Tanner, you are under arrest for civil rights violations, unlawful detention and mishandling of classified materials. You have the right to remain silent. Handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The crowd erupted in whispers, gasps, even cheers. Cameras captured every angle. Tanner's career had ended in the very moment he believed he was asserting dominance. Wilson lifted a hand, quieting the crowd. His voice carried with the weight of command. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today was not just about me. This was about a pattern that has harmed countless military families. Your recordings, your voices will ensure this moment is not ignored. Mrs. Chen, still live streaming, asked the question that everyone was thinking. General Wilson, how long has this been happening? Wilson met her gaze. For 6 months. I have been investigating reports of systematic profiling of military personnel of color by civilian law enforcement. The documents you saw contain evidence of over 200 incidents in the past year alone. Gasps rippled again. Phones captured his every word. This, Wilson continued, was not an accident. It was part of a larger mission. And now, with your help, the truth will reach the nation. The crowd pressed closer, their faces etched with a mix of shock, pride, and outrage. They had come to watch a charity ride. Instead, they had witnessed the unveiling of injustice on a national scale. And though part 2 of Wilson's story was ending here, the consequences of that day, the hearings, the reforms, the reckonings, were only just beginning. The streets of Millbrook had never seen anything like it. The quiet southern town, accustomed to weekend markets and high school football games, now throbbed with the thunder of helicopters and the grinding engines of armored vehicles. What had begun as a simple traffic stop had transformed into a scene that felt more like a military operation on foreign soil than a sleepy Georgia morning. People stood frozen, their phones held aloft, disbelief etched on their faces. For James Wilson, standing calmly beside his motorcycle, the surreal nature of the moment did not distract him from reality. He knew the stakes. The scattered papers that had fluttered across the asphalt weren't just bureaucratic forms, they were months of painstaking work, datasets and testimonies that told a damning story of systemic discrimination against soldiers of color. They were evidence of a pattern so troubling it had triggered the Pentagon itself to authorize a covert investigation. And now, thanks to Officer Tanner's reckless hands, those papers had been exposed to the wind, cameras, and the unknowing eyes of civilians. But Wilson wasn't just a decorated veteran on a charity ride. He was the chosen investigator, a man whose unimpeachable record had made him the perfect candidate to gather proof, to live the experience firsthand, to return with evidence Congress could not ignore. He had expected hostility. He had even expected profiling. But he had never expected his cover to unravel so completely, so publicly, in the middle of a small-town street. The military's arrival was both a relief and a complication. Relief, because the classified materials were now being carefully collected and secured by trained personnel. Complication, because the secrecy of his mission had been shattered. Cameras were everywhere. The live streams had already spread to millions. The anonymity he had carefully maintained for 6 months evaporated in minutes. His name, Major General James Wilson, was now attached to a story unfolding live in front of a global audience. Among the crowd, reactions varied. Mrs. Chen, still streaming, wiped a tear from her eye as she whispered into her phone, "I knew he wasn't lying." Others gasped audibly, their perspectives shifting in real time. Some of the bikers, veterans themselves, stood taller with pride, vindicated by the revelation that one of their own was not just a fellow rider, but a general on a mission of justice. Yet not everyone was relieved. Briggs, the young officer who had stood by as Tanner escalated, felt his stomach churn. The truth landed on him with crushing force. He had seen it coming. He had known something was wrong. And he had done nothing. As the crowd murmured about Wilson's rank, Briggs stared at his own hands, wondering if he would ever be able to wash away the guilt of his silence. Tanner, on the other hand, was unraveling. His face had gone from flushed to pale, his bravado dissolving as reality bore down. Shackled by federal agents, he stammered excuses. "I didn't know. He didn't look like a general." Those papers could have been fake, but his words fell flat. Every syllable was captured by cameras, every protest drowned beneath the roar of public outrage. Wilson, meanwhile, knew the larger storm was only just beginning. What had happened in Millbrook would trigger inquiries, hearings, investigations. Already he could picture the questions. How could a general be detained illegally on American soil? How could classified documents be scattered like trash on a highway? What did those documents contain, and what did they reveal about law enforcement practices across the country? He also knew the Pentagon's reaction would be swift. Somewhere commanders were on secure calls with congressional leaders. Somewhere agents were briefing the Secretary of Defense. Somewhere, strategies were forming to contain the fallout. Wilson exhaled slowly. Containment was impossible now. The genie was out of the bottle. The livestream numbers climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Screens across America lit up with Mrs. Chen's feed. Her voice, steady despite the chaos, narrated what viewers were seeing. This officer pulled over a man for nothing, searched his bike without cause, threw classified documents on the ground. And now you see he's a general, a major general, and the military is here to take control. Hashtags began trending. General's traffic stop, Millbrook, justice for soldiers. News stations interrupted broadcasts, cutting to the live feeds. Commentators scrambled to explain what viewers were witnessing. Some emphasized the outrage, others the shock, but all agreed this was no ordinary traffic stop. This was a scandal with national implications. Wilson stood firm, his bearing unchanged, as if decades of command had prepared him for this exact moment. Yet beneath the surface, he felt the weight of exposure. He had volunteered for this mission because he believed in its necessity. Soldiers deserved better. Veterans deserved better. Families of the fallen deserved a nation that honored their sacrifice, not one that subjected them to suspicion and harassment. But he had always envisioned presenting his findings in a controlled environment, in a secure room before Congress, with evidence laid out meticulously. Not like this. Not in the glare of a live stream still, he reminded himself. Sometimes history doesn't wait for the perfect stage. Sometimes it unfolds in messy, unplanned bursts that demand courage, not control. The helicopters circled lower, their rotors chopping the air. Military police moved with efficiency, securing the perimeter, cataloguing the scattered papers, and escorting Tanner into custody. One officer handed Wilson his identification back with a salute. "Sir, all recovered materials are accounted for." "Thank you," Wilson replied, tucking the documents securely into a case now guarded by 2 MPs. He turned back to the crowd, aware that every phone lens was aimed at him. He could have chosen silence, could have waited for official statements to spin the narrative. But his instincts told him that silence now would be betrayal. People deserved to know the truth from his own mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice resonant, "what you witnessed here today was not an isolated event. For 6 months, I have been investigating reports of profiling and harassment of military personnel of color by civilian law enforcement agencies across the Southeast. What you saw this officer do to me has been done to countless others, soldiers, veterans, families, whose only crime was the color of their skin." Gasps swept through the crowd. Phones shook slightly as people adjusted to capture every word. Briggs lowered his eyes, shame burning his cheeks. Wilson continued, "The documents that were scattered here contain evidence of more than 200 incidents in just the past year. Statistical proof, testimonies from decorated men and women who served this nation with honor, only to be treated as criminals in their own communities. This is not about one officer. It is about a pattern. And that pattern must end." The crowd erupted in murmurs, some angry, some supportive. Mrs. Chen's stream filled with comments. "Unbelievable. Thank you, General. This is America. We need to do better." Wilson raised his hand for quiet. "I did not choose for this mission to be exposed today. But since it has, I want you to know, everything you recorded, everything you live-streamed will help bring justice. Your courage to bear witness will ensure this story is not buried." Behind him, General Martinez nodded approvingly. The Pentagon had lost control of secrecy, but in return it had gained something equally powerful, a public reckoning. Briggs finally stepped forward, his voice shaking. "General," he faltered, swallowing hard. "I should have said something. I knew what my partner was doing was wrong, but I stayed quiet. I failed you." Wilson studied him with steady eyes. For a moment the silence was heavy. Then he spoke softly enough for the words to pierce. "Officer Briggs, recognizing failure is the first step toward change. What matters is what you do with this lesson." The young officer nodded, tears stinging his eyes. The weight of those words would follow him long after that day. As the scene stabilized, Wilson's mind drifted ahead. Congressional hearings were inevitable. Federal investigations would follow. Civil rights organizations would seize upon this case as a rallying cry. The Department of Justice would be forced to act. Millbrook, Georgia, a town most Americans had never heard of, would become a symbol of both injustice and reform. And yet, Wilson thought, maybe this was how it had to happen. Not in the halls of power, but in the streets. Not behind closed doors, but under the unflinching eyes of ordinary citizens with phones in their hands. Maybe this was the only way to tear down denial and force the nation to look itself in the mirror. He straightened, the faintest smile crossing his lips despite the chaos. The mission was no longer covert. It was out in the open, and that meant the real fight was only beginning. News of the Millbrook incident spread like wildfire. Within hours, national outlets dispatched reporters to the small town, satellite trucks clogging its narrow streets. The live-stream footage had already reached millions, turning what could have been dismissed as a local scandal into a national reckoning. Anchors spoke with visible outrage, commentators debated the implications, and veterans organizations issued immediate statements demanding accountability. In Washington, congressional leaders scrambled to respond. Some offices were inundated with calls from constituents who had seen the live stream and demanded action. Civil rights groups convened emergency meetings. Editorial boards drafted op-eds. What had started as the overreach of a single officer now forced the country to confront the broader question. How widespread was the profiling of military personnel of color, and how long had it been tolerated? At the Pentagon, the mood was no less urgent. The exposure of Wilson's mission meant the secrecy of the entire investigation had been compromised. But instead of retreating, senior officials recognized an opportunity. The public, already engaged and outraged, would become a powerful ally. Wilson's findings, paired with the undeniable images from Millbrook, offered proof too stark to dismiss. Wilson himself was transported to a secure facility for debriefing. But before he left Millbrook, he made sure to address the community one last time. Standing on the courthouse steps, flanked by uniformed officers and federal agents, he faced the cameras directly. "This is not the end," he declared. "This is the beginning of a conversation we must have as a nation. We cannot honor our soldiers abroad and dishonor them at home. We cannot send men and women into battle only to treat them as suspects when they return. Change is not optional. It is overdue." His words ricocheted across the country, replayed on every major network, quoted in headlines, dissected on talk shows. Social media erupted with hashtags. "We honor our soldiers," "Millbrook Justice," "General Wilson." Veterans and active duty soldiers shared their own stories, some heartbreaking, others furious, all pointing to the same painful truth, that discrimination did not stop at the uniform. For Officer Briggs, the days that followed were heavy with reflection. His failure to intervene gnawed at him. When questioned by federal investigators, he admitted his hesitation, his silence, his fear of standing up to Tanner. To his surprise, Wilson did not condemn him outright. Instead, the general's words echoed, "Recognizing failure is the first step toward change." Briggs resolved that if he had a second chance, he would act differently. Tanner, however, faced no such redemption. The evidence was overwhelming. The live streams, the testimonies, the classified documents mishandled in full view of the public. He was charged with multiple counts, including civil rights violations and destruction of federal property. His name became synonymous with reckless abuse of authority. Back in Millbrook, the community wrestled with its identity. For decades, the town had seen itself as quiet, safe, ordinary. Now it was the epicenter of a scandal that had forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. Yet instead of retreating into denial, many residents embraced the chance to change. Mrs. Chen's diner became a hub for discussions about reform. Churches hosted forums on bias and justice. Veterans shared their experiences openly, no longer content to suffer in silence. Wilson, though removed from day-to-day events in Millbrook, followed the developments closely. He knew this was bigger than one town, bigger than one state. His mission had always been national in scope. And now, with the investigation thrust into the spotlight, Congress had no choice but to respond. Hearings were scheduled within weeks. When Wilson appeared before lawmakers, his testimony carried the weight of both data and lived experience. He spoke not as a victim but as a commander, laying out the evidence systematically, the statistics showing disproportionate stops, the testimonies of veterans disrespected despite their service, the policies that enabled bias to flourish unchecked. Senators listened in silence as he described the fear he had felt not under enemy fire overseas, but during a traffic stop in his own country. "I have led soldiers through war zones," he told them. "I have walked through minefields, faced enemy fire and buried my men. Yet nothing prepared me for the moment I realized that my service, my sacrifice, my very humanity could be disregarded because of the color of my skin. That is not the America I fought to defend, and it must change." His words, broadcast live, struck a chord with millions. Letters poured into congressional offices. Citizens demanded reforms. For once, the political will aligned with public outrage. The Department of Justice launched a sweeping investigation into police departments across the Southeast. Funding was tied to compliance with civil rights standards. Training programs were overhauled. Accountability measures tightened. But perhaps the most powerful transformation was cultural. The image of a major general standing with dignity as an officer tore through his belongings became symbolic of a deeper struggle. It forced Americans to ask hard questions about identity, service, and justice. It reminded them that uniforms did not erase prejudice, and that patriotism required more than flags. It required fairness. For Wilson, the exposure of his mission changed the course of his life. No longer could he operate in the shadows. He became a public figure, a reluctant symbol of resilience under pressure. He accepted the role because he knew the fight was larger than himself. He began traveling, speaking to communities, urging dialogue between law enforcement and veterans, between officers and citizens, and through it all, he returned often to the lesson of Millbrook, that the power of change lay not only in the halls of government, but in the courage of ordinary people. Mrs. Chen, with her live stream. Marcus Thompson, with his phone call. The bystanders who refused to look away. Their actions had turned an illegal stop into a national turning point. By the time the Millbrook hearings concluded, reforms were already underway. Wilson's findings became part of the official record. Tanner's downfall served as a warning. Briggs's confession sparked discussions about the cost of silence. And Millbrook, once an anonymous dot on the map, became a symbol of accountability and hope. For Wilson, part 3 of his journey ended with quiet resolve. The battle for justice was far from over, but the evidence had been laid bare. The country could no longer claim ignorance. Change had been forced into the open, and though he knew the road ahead would be long, he also knew it had begun in earnest, on a small-town street where a general refused to bow to injustice, and where the sound of helicopters announced that history was watching. The roar of military engines still echoed through Millbrook as the dust settled, and the reality of what had unfolded began to sink in. For the townspeople, it felt as though they had witnessed a scene from a movie, armored vehicles cutting off streets, helicopters circling overhead, soldiers fanning out with practiced precision. But this was no fiction. It was their town, their streets, and their police officers at the center of a scandal that was now sweeping across the country. At the heart of it all stood Major General James Wilson, calm despite the storm, his posture straight and unshaken, as though 30 years of service had prepared him for this exact moment. For him, the arrival of the military wasn't just a rescue, it was confirmation that the system he trusted was still capable of responding when called upon. Yet he also knew that the damage done here could not be measured simply in scattered documents or tarnished reputations. It would ripple outward, touching law enforcement agencies, communities, and families far beyond Millbrook. General Martinez moved briskly to Wilson's side, saluting once more before speaking in a low, urgent tone. "Sir, the documents are secured, but the live stream footage is everywhere. We can't contain it. The Pentagon is already coordinating with Washington." Wilson gave a small nod. "Then containment isn't our mission anymore. Transparency is." His words carried the clarity of command, spoken not just for Martinez, but for the cameras and the crowd that remained riveted on every movement. Around them, federal agents completed the arrest of Officer Tanner, his wrists locked in steel cuffs, his eyes wide with disbelief as he was led away. Only minutes earlier, he had believed himself the authority, the one in control. Now he was a disgraced officer in custody, the embodiment of the arrogance and prejudice that Wilson's investigation sought to expose. The townspeople murmured in hushed tones, some clutching flags, others simply standing in stunned silence. Mrs. Chen, still holding her phone aloft, whispered into her live stream, "He's a general. They arrested the officer. This changes everything." The comments poured in by the thousands, viewers across the nation reacting in real time to a scene that no one could have imagined at sunrise that morning. Wilson turned toward the crowd, his voice steady and commanding, honed by years of addressing troops before battle. "Citizens of Millbrook," he began, "what you have witnessed today was more than a traffic stop. It was more than an abuse of authority. It was the exposure of a pattern that has harmed soldiers, veterans, and families across this nation." His hand gestured toward the soldiers collecting the last of the papers. "These documents contain proof, statistics, testimonies, evidence that discrimination against military personnel of color is not isolated, but systematic. For months I have lived this reality undercover, gathering these truths. And today, because of what happened here, the nation will see it too." Gasps rippled through the crowd, the weight of his words settling like stone. To them, Wilson wasn't just a passing rider anymore. He was a living testament to sacrifice and resilience, standing tall even after humiliation. His calm dignity contrasted so sharply with Tanner's aggression that it left no room for doubt about who had embodied real authority that day. General Martinez stepped forward, raising his voice so that both the crowd and the cameras could hear. "Major General Wilson is correct. What happened here will not be hidden. Federal oversight is already underway, and the Department of Justice will be conducting a full investigation. We thank you, citizens, for bearing witness. Your presence ensured that this incident could not be ignored." The murmurs of the crowd swelled into applause, tentative at first, then building into a wave of support. For many, the experience of watching injustice unfold and then be overturned in such dramatic fashion was transformative. They would never forget the image of Wilson standing calm under pressure, his dignity unshaken, his faith in justice unwavering. Meanwhile, Officer Briggs stood at the edge of the scene, his face pale, his hands trembling. He had not been arrested, but guilt clung to him like a second skin. When he finally stepped forward, his voice cracked as he addressed Wilson. "General, I failed. I saw it happening and I did nothing. I should have stopped him. I didn't." Wilson regarded him with steady eyes, letting the silence linger long enough for the weight of the moment to press down on everyone present. Finally he spoke. "Officer Briggs, courage isn't measured by what you intend to do tomorrow. It's measured by what you do in the moment that matters. Today you failed, but tomorrow is another chance. The question is, what will you do with it?" The words struck Briggs with the force of truth. His eyes brimmed with tears as he nodded, unable to respond. The crowd watched, recognizing that the lesson wasn't just for one young officer, but for all of them. That silence in the face of wrongdoing carried its own cost. As the scene drew to a close, Wilson was escorted into a waiting vehicle, the convoy preparing to depart. Yet before stepping inside, he turned once more to address the townspeople. "Justice doesn't arrive in helicopters," he said. "Justice lives in what we choose to tolerate and what we refuse to ignore. Today you refuse to ignore. That is how change begins." The applause that followed was louder this time, filled with pride and conviction. Phones captured the moment, broadcasting it across the nation, ensuring that his words would echo far beyond Millbrook. In the days that followed, the footage dominated every news cycle. Clips of Tanner rifling through classified documents played alongside images of helicopters descending on the town square. The hashtag Chung's General's traffic stop trended for days, sparking debates across dinner tables and in congressional offices alike. Commentators framed it as a turning point, a mirror held up to America's conscience. In Washington, hearings were announced with unusual speed. Lawmakers, pressured by an outraged public, summoned Wilson to testify. He sat before the committee with the same calm he had shown in Millbrook, laying out his findings piece by piece. Charts of disproportionate stops, sworn accounts of harassment, data that left little room for denial, all of it spread before the nation. And then came his most searing testimony. "I have faced enemy fire in deserts and jungles," he told them. "I have carried men off the battlefield, written letters to grieving families, and buried friends who never came home. But nothing prepared me for the fear I felt during that traffic stop, not fear of bullets, but fear that my years of service, my dedication to this nation, my very humanity, could be erased by prejudice in an instant. That cannot be the America we defend. That cannot be the justice we promise. The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on every senator, every reporter, every citizen watching at home. It was a silence not of disbelief, but of recognition, the kind that precedes change. Outside the hearings, protests and rallies called for reform. Civil rights groups and veterans organizations stood side by side, demanding accountability. Policymakers, faced with undeniable evidence and unrelenting public pressure, began drafting legislation to tie federal funding for police departments to civil rights compliance and community trust metrics. The seeds of reform planted in the streets of Millbrook were now sprouting in the halls of Congress. But for Wilson, the moment of greatest significance had already passed. It wasn't in the testimony or the headlines, or even the sweeping reforms that followed. It was in the faces of the townspeople that day, the shock turning to resolve, the silence turning to applause, the recognition that justice wasn't abstract but immediate, personal, urgent. He had seen in their eyes that change was possible, that ordinary citizens could bear witness and shift the course of history. As he left the Capitol after his testimony, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and microphones thrust forward. Wilson paused only long enough to speak a single sentence that would be quoted across the nation. "We cannot defend freedom abroad while denying dignity at home." That sentence, simple yet powerful, became the rallying cry of the movement that followed. It appeared on banners, in speeches, in classrooms and police academies. It reminded Americans that the values etched into uniforms and flags meant little unless they were lived out in everyday encounters on their own streets. Back in Millbrook, life slowly returned to normal, though nothing would ever quite be the same. The town that had once been anonymous now carried the weight of history. For some, it was a burden. For others, a badge of honor. But all knew they had witnessed something that would be remembered for generations, the day a general stood against injustice and the nation listened. The weeks following the Millbrook incident were unlike anything the town or the nation had ever experienced. What had begun as a single traffic stop spiraled into one of the most widely viewed and hotly debated events in modern American history. The footage captured by Mrs. Chen and amplified by millions online transformed a local abuse of authority into a national reckoning. People who had never heard of Millbrook now knew its name, its streets, and the faces of the men involved. For Officer Mike Tanner, the fallout was immediate and devastating. The arrest that day was only the beginning. Federal prosecutors moved swiftly, charging him with civil rights violations, destruction of government property and unlawful detention. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Countless videos, eyewitness testimonies, and most damning of all, the classified documents he had mishandled in front of the world. He was suspended without pay, stripped of his badge, and paraded before the courts not as an officer upholding the law, but as a man who had disgraced it. His trial became a media spectacle. Reporters filled every seat, commentators dissected his every move, and legal experts predicted his fate. When he finally stood in court, Tanner attempted to explain himself. He claimed he had acted out of caution, that he had been misled by training to see bikers as threats, that he could not have known the man before him was a general. But the excuses rang hollow. The jury, swayed by the damning footage and the testimony of witnesses, found him guilty. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, followed by community service, and permanently barred from serving as an officer anywhere in the country. Yet the story of Mike Tanner did not end with his sentencing. Inside prison walls, stripped of the uniform that had once given him power, he faced himself for the first time. At first, bitterness consumed him. He railed against the system, convinced he was a scapegoat. But as the days turned into months, something began to shift. He attended mandatory diversity and sensitivity programs, initially resistant, but slowly the stories he heard began to break through. Accounts from other inmates, histories of discrimination, lessons on bias each chipped away at the defensive wall he had built. Books he once would have dismissed sat open on his bunk, their words planting seeds of understanding. 18 months into his sentence, Tanner wrote a letter that shocked everyone who read it. It was addressed to Major General Wilson. "General," it began, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know what I did that day was not just wrong, it was evil. I let my prejudice blind me to your humanity, your service, and your dignity. I am ashamed. I don't expect redemption, but I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." When Wilson read the letter, he surprised even himself. He agreed to meet Tanner in prison. The encounter was tense at first, two men bound together by a single moment of injustice. But Wilson saw something in Tanner's eyes that day, genuine remorse. He later told reporters, "I believe in accountability, but I also believe in redemption. Tanner made terrible choices, and he's paying the price. But he is also doing the hard work of change. That's more than many do." Officer Dave Briggs, by contrast, took a different path. Though he had not been charged, he carried the weight of his silence heavily. In the weeks after the incident, he voluntarily enrolled in advanced training on constitutional law and civil rights. He sought out mentors who could guide him toward becoming the officer he had once dreamed of being. Slowly, he began to rebuild himself, not through denial but through acknowledgement. 2 years later, Briggs was promoted to sergeant and placed in charge of training new recruits. On his first day addressing a class of young cadets, he began with words that silenced the room. "Let me tell you about the day I failed. The day I watched injustice happen and did nothing. That day taught me what it really means to serve and protect." His honesty, raw and unfiltered, set the tone for a new generation of officers who would learn not only tactics and law, but courage. The courage to speak up, even against a partner. For the town of Millbrook, the transformation was profound. The police department underwent a complete restructuring. New leadership was installed, new policies adopted, and federal oversight established. Community forums were held regularly, giving citizens a voice in shaping the future of policing. For the first time in years, trust began to grow between law enforcement and the people they served. Mrs. Chen's livestream, viewed over 50 million times, became a symbol of the power of ordinary citizens to hold authority accountable. Her diner, once just a local gathering spot, turned into an unofficial community hub where discussions about justice, equality, and reform flourished. She was awarded civic commendations, but more importantly, she was celebrated by her neighbors as someone who had changed the course of history simply by refusing to look away. Marcus Thompson, the Vietnam veteran whose quick recognition of the documents had alerted the Pentagon, was honored as well. He received a civilian commendation for his role and used his moment in the spotlight to advocate for better treatment of veterans nationwide. His words resonated deeply. "We served this country with everything we had. All we ask is to be treated with the dignity we earned." The ripple effects of Millbrook spread far beyond Georgia. Across the country, police departments re-evaluated their training programs. Civil rights organizations gained renewed momentum. Law schools began incorporating the incident into their curricula, teaching future lawyers about the intersection of military service, race, and civil rights. Policymakers referenced the case as they debated reforms, using it as both a warning and a roadmap for change. For Wilson, the incident marked a turning point, not only in his career, but in his life. After 30 years of military service, he announced his retirement from active duty. But he was not stepping away from public service. He was expanding it. Appointed to lead a new federal task force on civil rights and policing, Wilson found himself with the authority to investigate departments, recommend reforms, and ensure accountability on a scale he had never imagined. His first major initiative was the creation of mandatory bias training for all law enforcement officers, built around the Millbrook case as a central example. The program, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations and police unions, was implemented in over 3,000 departments nationwide. Early results were promising. Complaints decreased, use of force incidents dropped, and communities reported improved trust in their officers. But Wilson's most impactful work was often the quietest. He made time to meet with officers who had stumbled, those whose records showed bias or misconduct. Sitting across from them, he spoke not with condemnation but with challenge. "Hate is learned," he told them, "but so is respect, so is justice. The question is, which are you willing to learn?" His approach wasn't universally popular. Some activists wanted harsher punishments. Others distrusted his emphasis on redemption. But Wilson believed in his heart that true reform required not only removing bad officers, but transforming those willing to change. The results spoke for themselves. Departments that embraced his methods saw measurable improvements, not just in statistics but in morale. Officers felt supported, communities felt heard, and slowly bridges began to form where before there had only been walls. On the one-year anniversary of the Millbrook incident, the town gathered for a unity rally. What had once been a place synonymous with scandal had become a model for reform. The streets where helicopters had descended were now filled with banners calling for justice, booths offering community resources, and a stage where leaders and citizens spoke side by side. At the center stood Major General Wilson, now retired from active duty, but more influential than ever. The event featured voices from every corner of the story. Mrs. Chen recounted the moment she decided to live stream, urging others never to underestimate their power as witnesses. Marcus Thompson spoke about the importance of veterans being recognized, not only for their service abroad, but for their rights at home. Officer Dave Briggs stood humbly before the crowd, acknowledging his silence and pledging to dedicate his career to teaching recruits the courage to intervene when injustice rears its head. And then, in perhaps the most surprising moment of the day, Mike Tanner appeared via video link from his halfway house. His presence was controversial. Some objected, some turned away. But Wilson had insisted he be included. When Tanner's face appeared on the screen, he looked gaunt, older, and chastened. His voice cracked as he addressed the town. "A year ago," he said, "I was the worst kind of police officer, the kind who saw enemies instead of neighbors, threats instead of citizens. The man I arrested that day had spent 30 years protecting freedoms I violated in a matter of minutes. I can never undo the harm I caused. But I can promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes." The crowd was silent, processing the gravity of his words. Some felt anger, others pity, but many recognized that this too was part of the lesson of Millbrook, that justice was not only about punishment, but about transformation. Wilson followed Tanner's remarks with his own. "Redemption," he told the crowd, "is not a gift we hand out freely. It is earned through accountability and change." Tanner failed terribly, but he is now choosing a different path. "If we do not believe people can change, then reform is impossible." And I refuse to believe that. The rally ended with applause, not thunderous but steady and resolute, the sound of a community that had been tested and emerged stronger. From Millbrook, the ripples spread nationally. Congress passed legislation tying federal funding for police departments to compliance with civil rights standards. Departments were required to undergo regular reviews, with community members invited to participate. The military implemented new programs to support veterans who faced discrimination at home, providing legal resources and counseling services. Law schools introduced new courses examining the intersection of race, policing, and military service, often using the Millbrook case as a primary example. Police academies across the nation redesigned their curricula, emphasizing de-escalation, bias recognition, and constitutional rights. But perhaps the greatest change was cultural. The image of Major General Wilson standing calm as an officer, tore through his belongings, became a symbol of dignity under pressure. It appeared in editorials, in art, even in classrooms where teachers used it to spark conversations about justice and equality. Young people, particularly those of color considering military service, looked to Wilson as proof that resilience could spark reform. Veterans who had long felt voiceless began speaking out, emboldened by his example. Wilson himself became something he had never sought to be, a national figure, a symbol not of power, but of principle. His speeches drew crowds, his task force achieved measurable results, and his name was invoked in discussions of reform from city councils to Congress. Yet he remained humble, often deflecting attention back to the citizens of Millbrook. "It was not me alone," he reminded audiences. "It was the woman with the phone, the veteran with the call, the crowd that refused to look away." Democracy survives because ordinary people decide to act. 2 years after the incident, Wilson received a letter that moved him more than any medal he had ever been awarded. It came from a 12-year-old girl in Detroit named Aaliyah. "Dear General Wilson," it read, My daddy is in the army and he showed me the video of what happened to you. He said you stayed calm even when the officer was mean, and that you used your brain instead of getting angry. I want to be like you when I grow up. Can you tell me how to be brave like that?" Wilson's reply was simple but profound. "Dear Aaliyah, bravery is not the absence of fear. It is choosing to do what is right even when you are afraid. That day in Georgia, I was scared, but I remembered I represented something bigger than myself, my fellow soldiers, my family, and young people like you. Real strength comes from treating others with dignity, even when they do not treat you the same. If you want to be brave, start there." That exchange became the foundation of a mentorship program connecting young people with veterans and law enforcement officers committed to justice. Known as the Aaliyah Project, it spread rapidly, offering guidance to children across the country and creating bonds between communities that had once been divided by mistrust. By the 5th anniversary of Millbrook, the changes were undeniable. Complaints against police in reform departments had plummeted. Use of force incidents were down significantly. Community trust, measured by surveys, had risen higher than at any point in decades. The Millbrook model, as it came to be called, was studied around the world as proof that accountability and reform could coexist with safety and order. Wilson, approaching his 70th birthday, continued to travel, speaking not just in government halls but in schools, community centers, and churches. His message was consistent. The most important battles are not fought overseas. They are fought here, in our neighborhoods, in our choices, in the way we treat each other every day. His words drew standing ovations, not just for their eloquence, but for the lived truth behind them. For Millbrook itself, the legacy was both sobering and proud. The town that had once been defined by scandal was now defined by change. Its police department, once distrusted, became a model for others. Its citizens, once bystanders, became participants in shaping justice. The memory of helicopters descending was still vivid, but now it symbolized not fear but hope. And for Wilson, the journey that began on a quiet September morning, with the rumble of a Harley, had become something far larger than himself. What he had endured, what he had exposed, what he had inspired, these were not just his story, but America's. The story of how dignity under pressure could reveal injustice, how ordinary people could turn a moment into a movement, and how even the worst failures of authority could become the seeds of redemption and reform. As he often told audiences, "We cannot wait for someone else to fix what is broken. We must choose courage over comfort, justice over convenience, hope over hate." That is what Millbrook taught us. That is the legacy we must carry forward. The applause that followed was always loud, but Wilson never heard it as praise for himself. To him it was the sound of a nation remembering its values, reclaiming its promise and recommitting to the work of justice, not just in courts and congresses, but in every street, every encounter, every choice. Years had passed since the day Millbrook became a turning point in the national conversation about justice, dignity, and reform. Yet for Major General James Wilson, the memory of that September morning remained vivid. The flashing lights in his rearview mirror, the officer's hand resting menacingly on his weapon, the rustle of classified documents scattering across asphalt, and then the thunder of helicopters that announced accountability, had finally arrived. That day had not only changed the trajectory of his own life, but had reshaped how America viewed the treatment of its veterans and the role of its police. After 3 decades of military service, Wilson had retired, but he had not stepped back from duty. Instead, he took on a new mission, leading a federal task force dedicated to civil rights and policing. With his reputation for integrity and the symbolic weight of Millbrook behind him, he wielded an authority that could not easily be dismissed. His task force launched investigations into departments across the country, issued recommendations, and held agencies accountable in ways that had once seemed impossible. The reforms inspired by his leadership began to show tangible results. Complaints against officers declined, community trust rose, and use of force incidents decreased significantly. Police unions, once resistant, found themselves at the table negotiating meaningful changes. Civil rights advocates who had long struggled for traction now had a powerful ally within the system itself. And yet, for all the structural victories, Wilson believed the most important changes happened in smaller, quieter spaces, in conversations, in mentorship, in the willingness of one person to treat another with dignity. It was this belief that drove him to launch mentorship programs that paired veterans with young people in underserved communities. Out of this vision grew the Aliyah Project, named after the 12-year-old girl whose letter had touched him more deeply than any medal or commendation ever could. "How do I be brave like you?" she had asked. Wilson's reply, "Bravery is doing what's right despite fear," became the foundation of the program. Veterans visited schools, shared their stories, and taught children that strength was not about dominance, but about respect. Police officers who had embraced reform joined these sessions, creating bridges between groups that had once eyed each other with suspicion. The program spread rapidly, not because of federal mandates, but because communities embraced it. Parents saw their children inspired. Teachers witnessed students writing essays about courage, empathy, and justice. Young people who once felt invisible discovered role models who understood them. For Wilson, these letters, essays, and conversations mattered as much as congressional hearings. They were proof that change was not just policy but culture. Still, he was not naive. Resistance remained. Some departments dragged their feet. Some officers resisted training, grumbling about political correctness. Some citizens dismissed the reforms as cosmetic. But Wilson countered cynicism with persistence. "We cannot heal a wound by pretending it does not exist," he said at a police academy graduation. "We heal it by cleaning it even when it stings, and then giving it the care it needs to recover." His words were not fiery but steady, grounded in the credibility of a man who had faced real battlefields and carried real scars. Internationally, the Millbrook model gained attention. Delegations from Europe, Africa, and Asia studied it, curious how a small American town had sparked national reform. Universities abroad invited Wilson to speak. His calm dignity and insistence on both accountability and redemption resonated across cultures. He reminded audiences that injustice was not confined to any one nation and that the struggle for dignity was universal. Meanwhile, Millbrook itself transformed. The police department, once a symbol of distrust, became an example of progress. New leadership instituted community review boards, transparent complaint processes, and partnerships with local schools and churches. Crime rates remained low, disproving the myth that accountability compromised safety. Instead, the town discovered the opposite. When trust deepened, cooperation grew and public safety improved. Mrs. Chen's Diner, where conversations had once been whispered, now hosted community roundtables. On the wall hung a frame still from her famous live stream. Wilson standing calmly beside his motorcycle as Tanner rifled through his belongings. Underneath, a plaque read, "Never forget, justice lives in witnesses." Customers, both local and from afar, came to eat, to talk, and to remember. Wilson himself remained humble about his role. When asked in interviews if he saw himself as a hero, he always deflected. The heroes, he said, were the ordinary people who didn't look away. The woman who live-streamed, the veteran who called the Pentagon, the young officer who admitted his failure. Change doesn't happen because of one man. It happens because enough people decide they won't accept the unacceptable. Yet the nation continued to see him as a symbol. Invitations poured in for him to speak at universities, conferences, and commemorations. He used every platform to repeat the message that had become his mantra: "We cannot defend freedom abroad while denying dignity at home." Audiences, whether students or senators, rose to their feet in ovation. As he approached his 70th birthday, Wilson reflected often on the paradox of his life. He had survived wars overseas, only to find his greatest battle on a quiet street in Georgia. He had trained for combat, but discovered that the true test of courage was keeping calm under the gaze of prejudice. He had expected his legacy to be measured in medals and campaigns, but instead, it was measured in policies reformed, officers retrained, and children inspired. He never forgot the faces of that day: Tanner's sneer, Briggs's hesitation, Mrs. Chen's determined gaze through her phone camera, Marcus Thompson's recognition of the documents. Each represented a piece of the larger puzzle: bias, fear, courage, witness. Each reminded him that the fight for justice was not abstract, but painfully human. On the anniversary of his retirement from the military, Wilson gave a speech at a community center in Atlanta. Looking out at an audience of veterans, police officers, students and families, he said, "The Millbrook incident taught me something I hadn't learned in 30 years of service. The most important battles are not fought on foreign soil. They are fought in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our courthouses, in how we choose to treat one another. The uniform I wore overseas represented America's values. But the way we treat each other at home, that is America's values." The room erupted in applause, but Wilson's eyes lingered on the children in the front row, scribbling his words into notebooks. He knew the work was far from over. There would be more incidents, more resistance, more pain. But he also knew there would be more Mrs. Chens, more Marcus Thompsons, more young officers like Briggs who would choose courage the next time. That, more than anything, gave him hope.